So hi everyone, and welcome to this episode of Strange Encounters. And Ben and I are here this time with Gary Opit, who is an environmental scientist. He's going to talk to us about Yowie. So welcome, Gary.
Welcome, Gary.
Hello, Cheryl. Hello, Ben.
I'm glad you could join us. I'm really keen to hear your experiences with Yowies, because I believe you had you've had a couple of experiences, and one was in 2008 at Woodenbong. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct. So, but my first experience was when I was a National Park Ranger in 1971. And I've always been interested in natural history, of course. And by that time, I had worked with David Flay, the zoologist at Flay's Fauna Sanctuary, and I got a job as a National Park Ranger. I could identify every mammal, bird, reptile, amphibian or invertebrate at that time. I was in my very early 20s, and I could identify all the plants. And I worked as a National Park Ranger for the Queensland Forestry Service in those days. The National Parks Department or Service hadn't been instigated. And so I was up at O'Reilly's in Lamington National Park, and zoologist Peter Ogilvie was the very first zoologist employed for the National Park section of the Forestry Department. And anyway, and so I was doing a bit of research, like I was just collecting bird observations and things like that. And anyway, one night, and I wasn't there that night, I arrived the next morning. It was, my sort of couple of days off, and I arrived the next morning. And, well, I arrived that night, actually. I don't know, the next morning, that's right. So anyway, so the rangers had been perturbed because someone or something had attacked the National Park Rangers' cabin. We only had a small cabin, and we only had electric light. There was only one electric cable running to the house, and we had a small office, and there was the head ranger. I'm just trying to remember his name, and Charlie Richter was a young ranger, and anyway, they'd been disturbed by something banging on the side of the house, and the rangers' quarters are still there. It's opposite now the O'Reilly's bistro and restaurant, and where they used to feed the parrots, if they still do, crimson rosellas and king parrots. So in those days, there was nothing there hardly. There was just a little store, a very tiny store that one of the O'Reilly's ladies ran, and the guest house, and very few people going up there in those days, just mainly bushwalkers. And so something began thumping the walls of the cabin or house, and then whatever it was went underneath the house, because the house was built on a slope, so the front door was level with the road, and then the land swept downhill, and so the back of the house was like 2 stories high on stumps, typical old timber house, and something in the pitch blackness had thrown all our heavy tools out onto the lawn. And then I was going to take a photograph of them lying there, and Bernie was the head ranger. I've forgotten his last name. He said, "Oh no, let's just throw them all." And I thought, oh, it's only photographs of tools thrown out on the ground, because we were wondering what on earth could do such a thing. And anyway, then we had to collect our own firewood. There was no power points into the place, and so we had a big fuel stove. So we cut up timber with the axes, and we piled them up in a huge wood pile. It was about 2 meters tall, a meter high, and 4 or 5 meters long. Big pieces of timber that we'd cut with a chainsaw from a fallen gum tree fallen across the main road. And so we had big pieces of timber, each one about like 1/2 meter across, quite heavy. And then we'd sledgehammered about 6 big timber stakes about 1 meter into the soft basalt soil to hold the whole structure up. And then, of course, if we wanted hot water, or we wanted to eat, then we had to cut up the timber and put it in the big fuel stove, and then we could heat water so we could have a hot cup of tea or cook our food. And then we had a big metal basin in the backyard. We built a fire underneath that and heated the water so we could have a wash. And something had attacked the wood pile and pulled out these stakes of timber and thrown the wood all over the place. And this was in pitch blackness. There was no outside lights and there was no lights. And so I asked the O'Reillys, what on earth could have done such a thing? You know, like, I mean, that's something big with hands, and there's nothing like that. It's not a possibility. And because we were thinking, could it be a ghost or a poltergeist or like what? It was impossible what had happened, that it attacked the house. It couldn't possibly be in a person. No person could have done that. And why would they? And in pitch blackness. And Bernard O'Reilly, he had been followed often in the rainforest, and he'd turn around and try to find what was following, but he was never able to see what it was. But when they were taking the cream down to Kerry on the stock route track, this is before the road was built up to the house, and you could only get down to Kerry into the valley. They'd camp the night on the way back, and they'd always had terrible roars coming from an escarpment, but they never knew what the animal was. So we knew there was some huge animal that could roar that no one had ever seen. It must be incredibly rare or secretive or something. It certainly wasn't a herbivore because there was no evidence of anything chewing on vegetation. And if it was a herbivore, there'd be piles of feces lying all around. And so it must have been some big carnivorous animal, but what it could be, we had no idea. It was an impossibility. And in 1975, I was by myself. I was staying in a little house just for a month on a friend's property, and I was exploring by myself, as I always did. I was always one to explore very remote areas. I'd be off for the day. Half the time I was lost, didn't know where I was, exploring a very remote rainforest on the eastern escarpment of Springbrook. And I had some animal roar at me, and it was quite unlike the roar of a lion or something. This was just something completely different, some big, loud, roaring, bellowing call. And I tried to get to it to see if I could find what it was that was roaring, but I sort of, it was too difficult to get up these giant boulders, all in deep rainforest. And then the next time I heard anything was on Tambourine Mountain in 1978. And I lived on Tambourine Mountain for about 25 years and explored the mountains thoroughly. And I completed several sections of the Natural History of Tambourine Mountain bicentennial book that was published by the Bicentennial Authority, or we got the money from Natural History Association we had up on Tambourine Mountain. And because I could identify all the plants and animals. So anyway, I heard this series of roars. It woke me up at about 3 a.m. I had a little timber house at the end of North Street beside the national park there, at Joala National Park. And this roaring, bellowing call started up, and it called about maybe 90 to 100 times, and they were powerful, sort of bellowing yells that sounded like, yay, 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 that was loud enough to awake you from, these calls are coming from hundreds of meters away, say, 300 or 400 meters away. And that showed me that, look, there's amazing animals in the forest. There's no two ways about it. Interesting enough, 3 dingoes started howling, as they often did in those days, because it was very quiet. There was almost no traffic. I'm talking about 1978. And so the 3 dingoes were howling, sort of on either side of this animal, 100 meters or so on either side. And they were going, oh, oh, oh. And this thing was bellowing, so I could compare the sounds of the bellowing with the howls of the dingo, and it was much more powerful than dingoes. You could hear the powerful voice being pumped out of a big chest. But I searched those forests and never found any sign of anything at all. But my neighbour, who was an old drover and cane farmer by the name of Frank Field, he told me that he's definitely an unknown predator. Was hunting little paddy melons that we had. These redneck paddy melons would hop around our gardens, and he found where they'd been killed, and also a possum and some animal. And he used to be a dingo trapper and hunter, and he said it wasn't a dingo or some animal unknown to science that was eating these paddy melons, and you could see where the paddy melon had been attacked. And this is just like on lawns and grass beside the edge of the rainforest. This is on sort of right adjacent to our houses, and the animal had been lifted off the ground, hadn't been dragged along the ground because there's leaf litter, so you could see what's going on, and then the guts had been pulled out and the animal was taken away. So he said to me, no, that's some unknown carnivore. We had no idea what it was. But so then it was around about that time that the Gold Coast Bulletin published articles, that amazing incident when Bill O'Chee and a whole group of about 20 Southport School students and their teachers observed a big gorilla-like animal on the lawns at that well-known resort up on Springbrook. Coonawarra, from memory, it's called Coonawarra, and so they saw this big animal, and the teacher and the students went after it to see if they could work out what it was. They looked at it with binoculars, and it was a big black gorilla-like animal. And then I had a very close friend, a very good friend, John Duncan, who was a National Park Ranger, and he had been in the Springbrook Rangers' quarters when the head ranger, the name of Percy Window, came rushing in to tell them, and he was as white as a ghost, to tell them that he had encountered an animal the likes of which he never imagined could possibly exist. And of course, this is that famous sighting that was then reported and published in the Gold Coast Bulletin. And of course, as rangers, our main job was to walk the tracks and keep the tracks in good condition for the visitors. And of course, in rainforest, you often have trees falling across the tracks. So your normal job would be to patrol the tracks with an axe over your shoulder. Whenever you found a tree falling across the track, you'd spend the next hour or two cutting through it and repairing the track. Usually not too much damage done. You just got to cut through the tree and move the midsection. So he was doing exactly that when he heard a series of grunts not too far off into the forest. And because he knew the wildlife. If you're a National Park Ranger, you know the wildlife because you see it every day. You're involved with it. And so he thought maybe it was a pig, because obviously a very large animal that was grunting. And he thought maybe someone's pigs got loose. But there's no farms or pig farms or anywhere. This was up at Best of All Lookouts in the Antarctic Beach Forest at about 1,000 meters altitude. So it's quite a remote spot there with the repeater station, a long drive up from the main township of Springbrook itself. And so no farms or anything in the area. But so anyway, so he carefully crept through the forest and came face to face with an animal that stood at least 2 to 3 meters tall and was very gorilla-like, covered in shaggy black hair, had gorilla-like feet and hands, a black shiny face, yellow eyes, a large mouth, and he stood face to face with it, only about 3-4 meters apart, for what he said was about 10 minutes. And he was so shocked. He was holding the axe in his hand, and but he said the animal wasn't the slightest bit aggressive, but it was just looking at him. And of course, it was impossible to identify what it was because no such animal is supposed to exist. We'd never heard the word Yowie, so we didn't have any name for it. And then he said then it just walked off with an unusual gait. It didn't walk like a person, and it sort of walked off sideways and disappeared into the forest. And then he said it made a bad smell as it left, and he said he vomited, first probably from the shock and of the whole experience. And so he informed the headquarters that he had encountered an unknown animal in the forest, a great big animal. So it's the largest native animal in Australia, and of course he's the most senior government official on Springbrook. So they believed him 100%. He wouldn't be telling lies. But they said they didn't want the publicity because they didn't want anyone to go and hunt this animal. Or you'd go in with guns, they're frightened it might attract people. And so that was the end of that. But the other people then, once it got into the paper, other people came down. There used to be a lovely zoo at Kirra called Natureland Zoo, and the owner of that also talked to the journalist at the Bulletin, describing how other people had encountered this same animal in the same locality near Best of All Lookouts. One chap living in his house he found the animal looking into his open doorway, and he was so terrified that he picked up a chair and threw it at it. And he said, and the animal just sort of walked off. He doesn't know if he hurt the animal. He doesn't think he did. Yeah. But and then interestingly enough, I was running eco tours in just before the global economic collapse. And I'd take tours up to Springbrook, and I knew Gary Maguire, who was researching glowworms, and I'd take these visitors to his glowworm cave and look at the glowworms, and Andre Clayton had the main restaurant up there, and he also had an observatory, and the both of them ended up making a plaster cast of some amazing footprints, giant footprints. When I have the cast right here, I can show it to you. And they had it exhibited for some years in the restaurant until he sold the restaurant, and he took the footprint with it, and then he sent it to me. But anyway, so he told me that one of his regular patrons, a Japanese gentleman who was a tour guide and ran a Japanese tour guide, a Japanese tour into the up to Springbrook and to look at the waterfalls and the rainforest. And this Japanese tourist said, "Are there people here that don't like Japanese?" And he said, "Oh, no." He said, "No, we all love Japanese. We love everybody. We wouldn't. Why do you say that?" He said, "We've just been attacked by a huge man." And he said, "What do you mean you've just been attacked?" He said, "We've just been to look at Best of All Lookouts, and on the way back through the Antarctic beach rainforest, suddenly there was a gigantuous man throwing rocks at us." And Andre said, "No one would ever do anything like that." He says, "Well," he said, the trouble was, he didn't look like a man. It was shaped like a man, but it roared like no man could roar." And then Andre said, "No, then look, that's an animal that's now known as the Yowie." And the Yowie, we don't know what it is, but my only encounter with it, as you said, was in 2008. And so in 1995, we moved from Tambourine Mountain, where I'd been for 20 years, and we moved down to northern New South Wales. I do fauna and flora surveys, ecological assessments, and so the threatened species legislation was brought in 1995. So a lot of work was available for me to do fauna and flora surveys for development applications, DAs, and then I also started my radio show, my wildlife talkback radio show, which will begin again on the January the 22nd. And that'll be the 25th year of continuous broadcasting. Wow. Where I have to instantly identify every species of mammal, bird, reptile, amphibian, or invertebrate from listeners, and also talk about different species and behavior and what have you. And people phone in and ask me for identifications and or talk about interesting things. So I've been doing that for many years. So so you know, my whole life I've been out in the bush, you know, and always lived in the bush, always doing just identifying the wildlife and identifying the plants and animals. And so in 2008, I was not far from our house, about 1 kilometre away, because we're adjacent to Billy Nudgel Nature Reserve in Woodbong. It's in Byronshire, and northeastern portion of Byronshire, near the beach, and it's all wilderness in this area. And I could hear. I was walking. I've got the date and everything. I recorded the date. I was with our small poodle dog, just a miniature poodle, a real bush dog, and we were walking along Jones's Road, and I could hear a very large animal pushing through very dense vegetation towards us from maybe 60 or 80, 100 metres away. Couldn't quite tell. And of course, we don't have any large animals that could make a noise like that. We have swamp wallabies as the largest animals, and dingoes. And so I thought maybe it was a cow, because we do have a cattle farm adjacent us, a 500-acre cattle farm with a couple of hundred head of cattle. And occasionally they get out and they'll be running across our property and you'll find their footprints in the nature reserve. But they usually just follow the tracks, and they obviously like to eat grass, so they don't push their way through dense vegetation. But anyway, it sounded as if it was as big as a cow. It was pushing its way through very dense vegetation, and so the environment it was moving through, it's coastal Wallam country, so it's sort of a woodland of scribbly gums and giant old man Banksias. But it's a very open canopy, and so the main vegetation are all kinds of tea trees, leptospermums, and a whole array of different shrubs, around about 3 metres tall, and interlaced with a barbed wire vine and various other vines. And so it's incredibly dense, and you have to very slowly push your way through it. And so anyway, this big animal was pushing its way through it, and then suddenly there was a very loud crack. And I thought, that's bizarre. First, I thought it had stepped on a stick or something that had cracked under its weight. And then there was more cracks, and this animal was coming straight towards us. And so my dog, Banjo, he barked a couple of times, sort of gave his warning bark, because he's very concerned something's coming towards us. He goes, ruff, ruff, you know. And I said, quiet, Banjo. And then I thought, well, that's it. The animal knows we're here now. We won't get to see what it is. Because I'm thinking, maybe this is one of these unknown animals, these Yowies, because this loud cracking of as if two big sticks were being whacked together continued to be heard. And it didn't make any difference that the dog had barked. It continued towards us, and for about another 5 minutes. And then these crackings of these two big sticks, they weren't rhythmical like a person, say, might be. They were completely irregular. So it might be every 20 or 30 or 40, 50 seconds, suddenly be another very loud crack. And it continued to push towards us, and the dog barked again, and it still continued. So approaching us for about 15 minutes. And then when it was 10 or 15 meters in, it moved parallel to the track away from us, and then it came back parallel to the track till it was right opposite me, and still occasionally giving this loud crack of the two sticks being whacked together. And then it went quiet, and I'm looking the whole time with a pair of binoculars, and I finally saw, I could just see the movement of some animal. It looked like it had brown hair and looked like it was about maybe 2 meters high, but I couldn't see the whole animal. I could only see glimpses of it, but it definitely wasn't a cow. It was an upright animal, but I didn't really see the face or anything. I couldn't really even tell what part of the body I was seeing. And then the vegetation wasn't moving, so it wasn't shaking the vegetation or anything like that. So I decided I'd push my way in to see if I could come to grips with this animal, see if I can get a good close look at it. So I carefully pushed my way into it, and I never heard it move off. I never heard another sound once I started moving towards it, and I found that I could pretty much follow the path it had pushed in, because there was no vines or anything that I'd have to duck under or try to break through to get through. And I pushed my way in, maybe 60, 70, 80 meters. Now I did find on the ground a bit of an unusual thing, an old man banksia tree that had rotted away, and all this rotted wood was quite soft, was lying on the ground almost as if it was a big bed, about the size of a bed, which is a very unusual shape for it to be like that, as it been placed there. But there was no impression of anything lying on it. There was no hair or anything. And then it was getting late, and so I very slowly pushed my way back out. And then I went back and then searched that whole area again. And it's very eerie, but I've been searching through that area for 30 years. And you always wonder, half the time I don't know where I am. Like, I'm completely lost because there's no landmarks. But I usually have a compass with me, or I'm just listening to this sound of the ocean far away, or where the sun is. And usually after an hour or two, I finally found my way back find my way back out of the forest.
After all these years, have you got any ideas as to what the cracking of the sticks is about? Is it some form of a communication, or what is that?
Yeah, it must be some form of communication. Like, I was walking along bird watching and making no sound at all. And so I was surprised that the animal approached me, or even knew that I was, because it was maybe, somewhere maybe like 100 meters back into the forest. And it was dense vegetation, so there's no way it could see me, and I wasn't making any sound, and I was just walking along the road. And I was walking slowly and quietly, and so how I even knew that I was there and was approaching me, I took it that it was simply a big animal moving towards my direction, and that's why I was being very quiet. And I was a bit upset that my dog barked twice at it, because I thought, once the dog barks, it knows I'm there, so it's not going to continue to come. And so I was astounded that even though the dog barked twice over about a 10-minute period, the animal continued to approach me, whacking these two sticks together. And it didn't sound like as if it was threatening or anything. It sounded like it was a communication or something. But the interesting thing, about 4 years later, in almost the same place, our daughter Loana and her partner Mateo were on the same track in the same area, had gone for a walk to the beach, and were coming back. And it's a very remote place. There's very few people ever move through that area. And within, say, half a kilometre of where I encountered the animal, they'd gone off the track about 30, 40 metres to look at an enormous tallowood tree, and they'd been there for 5 or 10 minutes, when they suddenly heard the footsteps of something very large and powerful running towards them. maybe, 50, 60, 70 meters away, and it got to within, say, 20 meters of them. Now, this is fairly open country, so it's very sandy. It's a very ancient sand dune, and it's covered in hoop pines and cypress pines and old man Banksias. And you can see a good 10 to 20 meters into the forest. So it never came closer to about 20 meters. And it repeatedly charged them with these big, heavy footsteps. And then there seemed to be two of them, either that or if it was rushing off and then charging in from another direction. So they slowly moved off, wondering if the animal was trying to chase them or was just trying to go past or was whatever. They didn't realize. They didn't know what was going on, but it was a very loud, very powerful animal making very deep thumping sounds as if it was charging towards them, but then it would always stop. Yeah. And then as they got, so they pushed their way back to the bush, and it came charging out, and it crossed the track right behind them. Wow. And they saw it, and sure enough, yeah, it was a big, hairy, black-haired animal standing 2 or 3 meters tall, running on its hind legs, and so it was something like a giant gorilla-like animal. And it crossed the track with, just within 2 or 3 steps. It was very fast, and it ran through the bush sort of beside them, and they hurried off home. Wow. So that was the encounters that I've had with the animal.
Yeah. It's almost a bizarre type of behavior rather than like even just plain warning you off from its territory. It's a really, really bizarre type of a way to behave.
Yes, look, it's very bizarre because it's something like, it's the kind of activity a gorilla, say in the Congo, if you get too close to them, the gorillas will have a mock charge. They'll charge at you, but they won't actually get close to you. It's just to frighten you off. Yeah. So that sounds like what that animal was doing when our daughter and her partner encountered it. But when I encountered it, it definitely wasn't trying to frighten us off. I mean, I would have walked past along the road there without knowing it was even in, because it was even in there 100 meters, and I only stayed because it was approaching and was whacking the sticks together. So that wasn't an aggressive activity, and it must be something with hands. And then of course, so then we had no idea. Back in the 1970s, we had no idea what the animal even looked like until the head ranger at Springbrook actually encountered it, and then it was then that in the late 70s and early 80s, etc., that Rex and Heather Gilroy, who I had actually had visited their natural history museum in Katoomba. Rex was particularly interested in entomology, and so he began with people visiting his little museum in the Blue Mountains. He was picking up reports of these unusual animals, and then he actually saw one himself, and he said, but this seemed more like a Homo erectus type, primitive man-like creature, and so he began advertising in the newspapers and magazines that he had seen this strange animal, and he wants to know if anyone else had ever encountered it. And he began to receive many accounts, and then he'd publish these in the local newspapers, or the journalists would write stories about them. But the most interesting reports. So I've received many interesting reports over the years, but the most interesting early reports came from the town of Woodenbong. And in fact, I just spent 5 days for my 74th birthday with my wife and my eldest daughter, Palila, at Woodenbong. And Woodenbong's, it's about couple of hours drive west of Wollumbar or Tweed Heads, through Kyogle and then Woodenbong. It's right there, close to the border ranges between New South Wales and Queensland. And Woodenbong's a lovely little rural township. And in 1976 and 1977, two amazing encounters with these Yowie-like animals took place in the suburban backyards of two of the residents, husband and wives, and it was Jean Maloney and I'm just trying to remember the other lady's name, Thelma Crew, and both independently observed these animals. One of them, she'd got up at 1 a.m. to have a drink of water, and she was standing at a kitchen window at the sink having a drink of water. It was full moon, looking out of the outside into the garden. And of course it's rural, so there's, you know, a rural town, so they're sort of large, fairly largish properties and vacant blocks and what have you. And from the vacant block next door, this large animal, a bipedal sort of man-like, hairy man-like animal, walked up and looked at her through the window. And it was moving its arms. It was going like this with its arms, she said, as if it was communicating with her.
Yeah. And
then it walked off. She realised there was two of them. And then the other lady, a few months later, I think about 10 months later, she had a more terrifying encounter. I think it was around 3 a.m. She suddenly heard her dog yelping in the backyard, and then this other sound, a squealing sort of a sound, and she thought, oh my goodness, something's attacking our dog. And so it was like a terrier. So she ran to the back door, flipped the big spotlight on that illuminated the back door, and then ran out the back door and came face to face with what looked to her very much like a Neanderthal, some sort of primitive man covered in hair, but very fine, sparse hair on the belly. And she could see its genitals. It had a like uncircumcised penis and testicles. The penis was about 9 inches long. And it was squatting down, squeezing her dog. And then, of course, as soon as she came crashing through, opening the door and running out with the light on, and she was within just a few meters of it, they were face to face, and it was squatting down, so it stood up and it put its arms out as if to make itself look real big, and it was big anyway. She just put the dog down, and they were just looking at each other face to face. She said it had a face, not like a gorilla or something, but more like a primitive man.
Right.
And then it just walked off, and had been eating the crab apples it had been eating the apples in the backyard.
That's not common from the reports that I've read, that it has like sparse hair on the body.
Yes, so
unusual.
There's the possibility that we're even dealing with more than one animal, because some of these reports, it sounds more like some relict hominin, something like that. David's Homo Denisovan, they found that the Indigenous Australian people and the Indigenous New Guinean people have 4 or 5% of a very ancient human known as Denisovan that was more closely related to Neanderthals, and so a very big and very possibly hairy primitive human. And they believe then they at least got into Southeast Asia or probably all the way to Australia and New Guinea, crossing across the Wallace Line. But otherwise, these other animals sound very much like Gigantopithecus, because they sound like just like the American Bigfoot and Yeti. It sounds like some very the animal that Percy Window had the face-to-face encounter with and described that animal that he described, it had a black shiny face, and it had a sagittal crest. It had its head rose up, a very powerful animal. So the only animals known in the fossil record that would describe those two things is one, some sort of relic human, and the other is a giant ape. But and as to how they got to Australia, because we don't have they're Asian animals, and we've never had Asian animals. There's never been a land bridge between Australia and Southeast Asia. But a lot of animals did get across, mainly snakes and rats. And it's believed they got across the Timor Sea rafting on vegetation. And so if that is the identity of these animals, then that's the only way they could have got here. For hundreds of thousands of years ago or whatever, when the whole island of Java, for instance, was covered in tropical rainforest, and tsunamis and cyclones would occasionally rip off great chunks of riverside vegetation, and so that, and then they drifted out to sea and eventually landed on the Australian north coast. That's the only explanation that I can imagine. Yeah. But I continue to receive these reports. I've received dozens of reports, and I've got a couple of very interesting recent reports. When I say recent, this is sort of 3 or 4 years old now.
Right. But before you go on with that, Gary, have you ever heard of any violent attacks on humans by Yowies?
No, I've never heard of any violent attacks. And I don't, it's just like gorillas. Gorillas were feared, and it was believed that they attacked people and tore them to pieces or whatever. Though, of course, it was proved that they're actually quite gentle animals, but they have this bluff charges. I think if they were dangerous, we'd know all about them. And so I've got a really interesting case. That's the most recent case that I received from a gentleman in the Gap in Brisbane. He grew up in Brisbane, and this is the most recent case that I've communicated with somebody. And at the beginning of the lockdown, when those first COVID-19 cases appeared in Brisbane, and everything was locked down for only a short period of time, I think a month or whatever it was. But this gentleman who's got a family, and he works in the chicken processing industry, and in the city there in an office, and he grew up in the Gap, and he's always enjoyed walking the tracks in the national parks directly adjacent to Mount Glorious and those other national parks nearby. So when the lockdown first started, you were allowed to go out for exercise. So he drove to the nearest national park, which was like only 5 minutes away from his house. And he said there was nobody in the car park, and normally there's cars there and people are going bushwalking. And he said he had the place to himself, and he walked some kilometres along this track, and he began to hear the sound of rocks being cracked together where the track crossed a creek bed with a small amount of water running it, and the typical large rocks and boulders down the creek bed. And so he figured, there's someone here. There's other people having fun or walking. He thought it was probably just teenagers, whacking rocks together. But he thought it strange because he hadn't seen any cars, and it was fairly remote bushland. And so he thought he'd see if he can have a closer look, because this sound kept on occurring. So he made his way up the creek bed, and as he got closer, he was walking through the rainforest on the edge of the creek, and he was within only 20 to 30 meters, and every now there'd be a very loud crack as if something was throwing rocks or something. And so he poked his head out to see who it was, and he was very surprised to see what looked like a totally hair-covered person about his height, with his back to the witness. So he's looking at this animal from behind, And he immediately realized, oh my goodness, this isn't a person. This must be one of these Yowies that he'd heard about, but he didn't believe for 1 minute. And he was just positive that it was some sort of, a myth or a fantasy or whatever. And there it was, with it standing on the rocks on the creek, and it was picking up these large rocks and throwing them hard down onto the ground, onto the other rocks, making that loud sound. And so he was watching that for very close, for a couple of minutes, when it turned around and saw him. And when it saw him, you got to see its face, and it definitely wasn't a human. And he said it made these strange bird-like chirping noises. And as soon as it did that, he discovered, this is not an adult, this is a young one, because suddenly the father stood up, who had been crouched down behind a rock or beside the vegetation, and looked at him, and the Yowie that was roughly about his size, he then realized, that's a child.
Oh my gosh.
And it roared at him. He says there was like a big gorilla-like thing, and it just roared at him like as powerfully as a lion. And of course, he'd turned around and ran for his life.
Yeah.
And I said to him, it's a pity you should have simply gone up to it, because it's not aggressive. Because just imagine if it was aggressive, what would have happened? The family would have reported him missing. The police would discover his car. They'd start walking the tracks, and they'd find his body torn to pieces. And immediately we'd know the Yowie's a real thing. Yeah. And you wouldn't be able to cover something like that up. I mean, if you find somebody that's been killed,
yes,
you can't cover that up. And so that's why I believe that the Yowies never attack people. It may be possible, but you imagine if you've got to attack people, there's going to be evidence, people are going to be missing, their car's going to be sitting there. They must have got into the forest where these Yowies live in some way. So there's going to be an abandoned car, or it's going to be a missing person. And then it's just like any sudden unexpected disappearance, especially of an adult. There's going to be search parties, and it's going to get onto the news. You're not going to be able to cover it up.
Yeah.
And the Aboriginal people said they never attacked people. And you have to remember that these animals, whatever they are, if they may be Gigantopithecus, which is a relative of the orangutan, but is only known from fossils from about 500,000 years old in China. So there's no fossils in Australia at all. But these animals have been living with people and with other species of humans, like Homo erectus, because it was Homo erectus until I don't know how long, maybe a couple of 100,000 years. But anyway, I mean, us humans, Homo sapiens, we're the most powerful apex predators around, and especially with dingoes, say Aboriginal people, Indigenous Australians, very remarkable hunters. If you were to kill a person, you would definitely be hunted down. The tribes people would hunt you down and spear you to death. And in fact, there are reports of Yowies, one Yowie having been speared and clubbed to death in the old reports collected by such people as Tony Healy and Paul Cropper in their book The Yowie and Out of the Shadows, Unknown Animals of Australia. Yeah. So yeah, I don't think they're dangerous, because we know all about them if they did. And that's why they're so unknown, because they know that you don't mess with humans, you don't touch them or do anything. You can try to scare them away, but you don't actually harm them.
Well, I had wondered if they were non-aggressive because they're living around humans, and let's face it, most 85% of the population lives on 15% of the land in Australia. So we're all along the coastal regions, except for the Indigenous people, like you say, but those communities are sort of stretched out too. And I did wonder whether the further that you know, how far inland have Yowies been seen, and if they're not used to humans, would they be more aggressive? You know, because they would have been. I imagine they're great observers.
They are. Look, I think so. They've been seen in every part of Australia, including Tasmania. A good friend of mine down in Tasmania described how this is a forest blockader. One night they had a very large and powerful animal. They thought it was a person, but they couldn't understand how it was circling them in the bush in the darkness. And there's been the audit report from Tasmania. I received a wonderful report from Western Australia, where a couple of women were driving into town or driving to work, but it was this is from memory, it was in the daytime or just close to dusk or something like that. And as they're driving, this is close to the coast in sort of central Western Australia, and an animal like a huge gorilla walked onto the road in front of them, and they were absolutely shocked. You know, the woman put the brake on, but kept on. They were in such a shock that the vehicle kept on slowly coasting right up to this huge animal, and it just stood there looking at them in the middle of the road, and then it walked off. And they were just absolutely amazed and flabbergasted, because these things aren't supposed to exist. There aren't supposed to be giant gorilla-like animals walking around in the Australian bush.
Yeah.
Yeah, Gary, I just, sorry, Cheryl, I just wanted to say you've given us enough information for probably another 5 shows.
Yeah.
But going back to the Tambourine, I remember you said earlier in the program that you had heard something in the forest that was making, you know, up to 70, 80, 90 bellows.
Yeah.
That's a fairly, I imagine, extended period of time. And a lot of these reports tend to be almost brief encounters, or, you know, they're not that long in the scheme of things, whether it's a sighting or not. And then you've been through those hills, like, you know them like the back of your hand.
Yeah.
And you've seen no evidence of the creature at all. How do you explain that? Well, it probably can't be explained, but in terms of, if it's a creature living in a forest, it must live somewhere, it must eat something, it must defecate somewhere.
Yeah.
Or is this some entity from another dimension, and it comes in and it goes from here? What are your thoughts on that?
No, I don't think there's any other dimensions. A paranormal is not an explanation. A perfect example is if, say, some criminal had committed some crime against you, and the police investigated and said, "Oh, we can't find any evidence, so whoever it was must have come in from another dimension." You would laugh at him. It was completely, that is absolutely ridiculous. You cannot use that as an explanation, because it means that everything else in the universe that we can see is explainable. How can something unexplainable suddenly pop into existence? And why does this thing come in from another dimension but only appears in dense forest and doesn't? Because if it could come in from in another dimension, it could suddenly turn up in a shopping mall. It could turn up anywhere. And so so I think you can't use paranormal as an explanation. There's no such thing as paranormal. There's only normal, but there's aspects of reality or normality that are difficult to explain. You can't say that. You can't shoot the messenger. You can't say, "Oh, that can't be real." And I love to read all of these different accounts, all kinds of things, ghosts and aliens and UFOs and everything. But paranormal doesn't, another dimension. There's no evidence for that. And why would it have such an abilities, and what's it doing? I mean, you can understand, like, say, if there's extraterrestrials and they've come from another planet, they've got a civilization that's more advanced than ours, and they're into space travel. You can understand that. That's not paranormal. That's normal. It just says some other life form coming from another vast distance. There could be other aspects of reality that we can't comprehend. For instance, ghosts. I always describe, well, ghosts, if you see a ghost, it should be naked because the clothes didn't die.
That's right.
So
I
why
couldn't
are
agree
they
with that.
clothed? Yeah, which means not to say that ghosts don't exist, but that is, I mean, the reality is constructed of the subatomic particles. You know, it's a quantum reality is made entirely out of consciousness, as it were, movement or whatever, and so it's as if the parts of reality, hey, people that have passed on, but we're all constructed out of electromagnetic radiation. You know, there's no such thing that's solid, and so it's almost as if portions, memories or whatever of that environment, you know, the environment that we're a part of, can survive in some way, and so it's as if a whole section, you know, to see a ghost means that whole environment has survived in some way. Otherwise, the ghost shouldn't be undressed. And as well as that, you know, our consciousness is mainly in our mind. It's also all through every part of our body because every cell is conscious. So, but otherwise, you might expect to see just a brain moving along, not the whole body, but certainly not a clothed body. So I mean, you can understand the paranormal as being part of our normal reality, except that we can't quite comprehend it. But for the Yowies, I think they're simply carnivores, and so if you try to see a tiger or a leopard or a puma, and like American scientists studying mountain lions, they could spend their whole career studying mountain lions and rarely ever get to see one, because carnivores live in very small numbers. You know, they have huge territories. They're naturally secretive because they're all ambush predators, and they have huge ranges. And so I think the Yowie is definitely a predator. And I've had reports of Yowies on my radio show being seen, like a gentleman driving down the Pacific Highway between Grafton and Coffs Harbour through the forest at about 1 a.m, and the headlights illuminate a man coming out of the forest with a kangaroo, full-grown grey kangaroo over his shoulder, and he's dressed in an overcoat, and the driver's slowing down so he doesn't hit him, and watching him and thinking, wow, look at this bushman, you know, walking around in the night with a kangaroo, but he's only illuminated because he's got the headlights. And as he approaches him, he realized, and as he gets to the other side, he says, oh, there's a family of them. There's the wife and the kids are there as well, and they're not wearing clothes, they're covered in shaggy hair. And one of the most interesting reports, I get reports from my radio show, the Yowies being seen in and around small towns. And one of the most interesting ones was from Mullumbimby, where a young lady was visiting her boyfriend on the edge of town, and just walked across the showgrounds to her boyfriend's place, living with his parents, of course. And the mother said, oh, he's out in the shed, he's working on his car. And so she started walking towards the shed, which is 30-40 meters sort of from the house, and the only light was like coming out of the back door and from the inside the shed. And as she approached the shed door, there was a tree, like a camphor laurel, growing near the shed, and she could see, oh, there's a black possum clinging to the side of the tree. So she walked up to have a close look at this possum and realizes, oh, it's not a possum, it's a head looking at me from around the side of the tree. And then it stepped out, and she was face to face with this thing that she had no idea what it was, but like the size of a gorilla. And it was imitating her. She said, oh, she was going, oh my, like, and it was doing exactly what she was doing. And she was standing back, and it would step back. And she yelled out to her boyfriend, you better come out here. There's a thing, great big thing here. And so she could hear her boyfriend walking out beside the shed wall. And it took a few steps over and was walking beside the boyfriend. He's inside the shed, and it's outside the shed, pacing him. And when they almost met, she yelled out, go back, go back. And so he rushed in, got in his car, reversed it out, and was still standing there. And it ran off, and he chased it with the car across the paddock a few 50 metres or something until it ran into the bush. And then I got another recent account where a gentleman by the name of Brendan, who's very interested in cricket, he's a cricketer, and he was driving from Yukai to Mullumbimby, where he lives, and he drove through the Mount Jerusalem National Park, and he had to go a call of nature, so he stopped the car, turned off the lights, got out of the car, and he heard this howl quite close, and he thought, dingo, and so he howled back. And when he did so, there was this incredible roar, and the footsteps of something come rushing up towards him, and he jumped back into the car, and he heard it run in front of the car, so he put on his big spotlights, and he illuminated and was standing right in front of the car, and he got the shock of his life. He said it was like a huge gorilla, and it was a female. It had breasts, but it was the breasts were sparsely covered with hair. The rest of the body was covered in black sort of shaggy hair, and it had a face, black shiny face, looked like a gorilla but on two legs, and it was swaying back and forth, looking at him in the spotlight. The engine was off, and he picked up his phone. He thought, I better take a photograph of this. No one's going to believe this. And then before he could get a photo, it charged off back into the forest. And so they're like the three. Then I received another report from the town of Lawrence, from some Baptist ministers who had listened to me on the radio show, and they had been constantly plagued by an intruder that would walk around their house and leave big muddy handprints on the door, and they'd phone the police. And this went on for 3 years, and the police would say, oh, yes, there's a madman around the town. He's a huge fellow, big, huge, hairy fellow. We have never been able to work out where he lives or who he is, but he's harmless. He never does any harm, but he trespasses. He prowls around people's houses and gardens. And eventually they were driving to the church past the sugarcane plantations, and they saw a man covered, what looked like he was covered in black hair, lying on the ground. And they thought, oh my God, what kind of a mad, hairy farmer is that? And then they thought, oh, but why is he lying on the ground? He must have had a heart attack or something, and it mustn't have been hair, it must have been just a shaggy pair of boots or something he was wearing. It was back to it. His back was to them. And so they turned the car around and went back, trying to see which, because they'd driven another kilometre before they decided they better turn around and see who this person is lying on the ground. And then they passed him again. It was in one of those little gaps where you drive the tractors through the sugarcane, and he was still lying there on the ground, and looked at him again, and then definitely covered in hair. And they turned around to cut, and then when they got back, he was gone.
Wow!
So that was they're like the 4 most recent accounts. Very unusual.
Yeah, that's amazing. I just find, I mean, I've got one last question if I could squeeze it in. And you may just think this is a load of codswallop, but I have heard from people who have had encounters with Yowies who have said that they felt there was some sort of telepathic connection. And I'm just wondering, have you had that from any of the people who reported things to you?
No, I've never had a report where people sort of communicate. I had a gentleman that actually went to the press, and I saw the news item where he wrote me a letter, and this is from like the Sunshine Coast, and he said that he was there camped in the bush, and one of these Yowies, a family of them, came out and were communicating with him, talking with him, and they sound like they were talking Latin or something. Now, whether it's just a complete hoax or this actually occurred, it's impossible to know with all of these anecdotal reports. There's no physical evidence of these animals. But some people have before they've seen the animal, they've become very frightened. And what I put that down to is infrasound, because we know big, powerful animals, and elephants are an example, they can make noises at such low frequencies that you can't hear them, but the sound travels. And if you were hit perhaps by this infrasound, that might terrify you, or perhaps they could even communicate with you, perhaps with this infrasound in a way that's non-frightening. But but anything's possible. We don't know. But to have telepathy, if telepathy was a possibility, and it may be possible in certain circumstances, that it's probably not an efficient use of the energy needed to create telepathy. You'd have to use a lot of energy in your mind, say, perhaps, or whatever. There's very little sign of telepathy used in the natural world. Like, you'd think if telepathy was possible, all the animals would be using it. Be a much better way for antelopes to tell each other there's a lion in the vicinity, let's get out of here, or what have you, or even the great apes or whatever, or even people. I mean, we've been around for a couple of 100,000 years or something like that, or 100,000 years. You would think telepathy, if it was possible, and it may well be, but it would be a very useful attribute to have. And yet it's virtually unknown. Like you hear of shamans and stuff using telepathy, but it's not an easy skill to have. It doesn't appear as a normal part of our array of essential abilities to survive.
Yeah, I think
that, in a natural environment.
I have one more question too.
Yeah, certainly.
Gary, you like working in the national parks and the service. Do you think that the National Park Service keep files on Yowie reports? Do you think that that's investigated by the government on any level?
No, I don't. No. Because when you if you have anything to do with any kind of government department, they're people just like you and I, you know, and they're busy. You know, one of our daughters, she's an ecologist working in the ACT National Parks, and so that there's no time available for people to be involved in anything but normal day-to-day activities. And so, like, I mean, the only people that might be interested in such things are like the security people, ASIO or what have you, police, national park rangers. I mean, they're flat out just doing their day-to-day activities, as you are in any profession. So there's, and if someone comes up and says, I've seen something a bit bizarre or something or other, you think, oh, well, that might be interesting. But you don't really have the time or inclination even to look into it. And if you yourself saw something like that, you'd probably keep it to yourself, because no one's going to believe you. But no, however, it's different if you've got Indigenous national park rangers. So the Indigenous that I'm in Bunjalung lands here, and Bunjalung National Park rangers have told me about circumstances, you know, experience that they've had. Very, very rarely, but we seem to have a little hairy man as well, a smaller species, which equates possibly with that the fossils found on the island of Flores, known as the Hobbit Homo floresiensis, and to the Indigenous people, they say there's two different bush forest people that actually live here, especially the old timers who used to live in the bush and knew them, and they said there's the large one, and they have their own names for them. So Yowie actually comes from us, the Aboriginal people, the Indigenous people that lived in the central New South Wales, Bathurst area, from memory, and it was the word Yowie that Rex and Heather Gilroy publicised. That's where that name came from. They read it in a paper that had been written by a anthropologist who had studied the Aboriginal language in the Bathurst area, and that was the name Yowie or Yahoo or Yowie. These were terms for a big, dangerous, sort of or scary, large, hairy, human-like creature that lived mainly in the mountains. And the shape of the animal seems to show that it's something that lives on escarpments, because to be a gorilla-like animal like that, it sounds like you live on cliff sides. But anyway, so they talk about the little hairy man as well, or little hairy people, and in this area they call them Nimbinjis, and the name of the town Nimbin comes from these Nimbinjis. And so a national park ranger only a year ago was telling me that on Mount Warning, the Nimbinjis would urinate on their equipment, which they left it overnight, and they would find plaited hair that had been plaited, laid across their boxes of tools, waterproof boxes of tools left in the forest. And they said, oh yes, they know these. They very rarely see them. Occasionally one will cross the track in front of you, but very, very rarely. But they're often their parents talk about them, knew them, because they were living more in the bush and knew them well. And that's how they'll often see them, or occasionally see them playing about. So that's another species. And I found a whole series of footprints in the forest, not far from where I encountered this big one, as if children had been playing in the mud, little tiny children footprints, about the size of a, I don't know, sort of 7 or 8 year old or whatever, but no other sign of footprints on a muddy track. And I took photographs of these unusual footprints where something had been playing in the mud. So Indigenous people will talk about them, but generally only to somebody they know is interested in Aboriginal, Indigenous Australian culture.
Yeah.
And of course, like, well, the police and ASIO, that's the last thing they've got time to be interested in, is something sneaking about in the bush, because basically the animal is harmless. It doesn't attack people, otherwise we'd know all about it. And they've got much better and more important things to do than try to cover up stories on. I mean, you can imagine that the heads of the department, they certainly wouldn't be interested in it, because they've got to account for all the money they spend. And if they were to say, oh, we've spent this few $100,000 trying to cover up stories of big hairy things living in the bush, they'd get the sack. So I think we can be pretty sure that there's no cover up. The city dwellers in particular have no interest in these things. I don't think there's a cover up or anything. I mean, there might be in the United States, you might have a different situation where you've got, governments with billions or trillions of dollars of money and all kinds of things going on over there. Who knows what they know over here? But I think in Australia, I don't think there'll be any government department ready to spend money on something that's virtually of no consequence to them whatsoever.
Very interesting.
Yeah, very interesting. You've got a lot of information. Have you written a book and published all of that about Yowies in a book?
I have. I can show you if you want to see it. I'll just grab it. It's just here. Hang on a moment.
No, that's an extremely interesting conversation, and and I agree to the point where there is vast mountain ranges and perhaps sparse population. So you literally could walk around out there for months and see nothing and no sign of them.
That's right. Yeah. So what are the books, Gary?
So that's my book there, and I published it self-published. It's called Australian Cryptozoology. Right. And that particular image, so I'm just seeing, you can see that that image was undertaken by Pixie Burns, and so it's called Australian Cryptozoology, and I just print copies out if anybody's interested. I gave several talks on cryptozoology at Nexus magazine conferences down in Sydney and in Brisbane and up on the Sunshine Coast. And so the reason that I was trying to determine if there was some sort of psychological aspect to these reports. People could be hoaxing. I've got no idea if people are making up these stories that I receive. I find it a bit unlikely because I could easily deride them. Like if I start telling you that I've got a unicorn in the garden or something or other,
exactly,
it's a bit unlikely you're going to believe me. In fact, you're going to think I'm an idiot. So, however, I collected all of these stories, and then I would give I've given copies out to people that had reported these, so that one of the reasons being is that if they then come back to me and say, oh, I've had further encounters, and they would elucidate even more interesting accounts. This is if it was a hoax or someone trying to make things up, and you would expect they'd come back with even more interesting stories. But that's never happened. Like the occurrences sort of happen once, and then that's it. Most people only encounter these animals once in their lives, and this is the best illustration I've seen of a yowie, and this was done by Pixie Burns after she had an encounter. She was squatting down in the forest. She believed that they existed, and she's got a bit of Aboriginal ancestry, I believe, and spent a lot of time with Indigenous people, and she'd heard a lot about them. And she was sitting in the forest, and she'd actually had this gorilla-like animal, or more like some ancient human-like animal, some sort of maybe Gigantopithecus or something, squat down, just much like a gorillas are known to do. You see those videos of them, like the big male will just sit down in front of you. This is about 25 meters away, but never look at you, and just sort of sit there and sort of say, to say, this is my area, and then move off. And I think also that women have a much better chance of actually studying these animals because they can identify us, males and females. They probably often watch us. They've probably got a very powerful sense of smell because they're living in the forest, and a sense of smell is important to them. And so they can probably tell, a male from a female, and they would know that males are dangerous, and that females are harmless. So you can get closer, say, to a female without less chance of being attacked. I had another fantastic report that took place in the Upper Clarence, where a gold prospector could hear some large animal moving about at night, and he walked out of the cabin that he was staying in, and was shining it around, and was suddenly face to face with one of these yowies that he'd always believed couldn't possibly exist. And it was they were about, he said that it was almost as if they were only a meter apart, and probably 2 or 3 meters, and he was face to face with it, and he was trying to tell himself that this was just another person, a camper, that he's shining his light at, and then until it snarled at him, and he realised, no, this is nothing like a person, and it's huge, because he realised that this individual was standing about a metre lower than he was, like on the slope, but they were at the same head height, and it had big teeth, very much like human teeth, but very dirty and yellowish, like as if he never cleaned his teeth, and it, like covered in hair, not like super dense hair, but quite hairy, but almost like some sort of human, like prehistoric human or something, and then it suddenly turned around and ran for its life, and he listened to it run down the slope and watched it with the torch. It ran 100 meters across the ground. It ran through the river, which was only like a meter or 2 deep. It climbed up the cliff, and then it threw a huge rock down behind it as if it was saying, don't you come and chase me. And,
Wow.
and we've got to remember that these Yowies, they're frightened of us.
Yeah.
Because they know, like, we don't act like a prey item. Like, if a kangaroo hears a noise, the kangaroo's looking around like that and then hopping off, right? But they would notice it if there's any kind of a disturbance, the humans come rushing over to see what's going on.
Yeah.
And they walk around like they own the place.
Yes.
And they're probably, when they're raised as young ones, then they'll probably have big territories. It's probably the parents are telling the young one, if they have some sort of primitive language or they communicate, if watch out, if you see one of the neighbours, like another Yowie family, well, they're territorial, run for your life, they'll give you a thumping or something.
Yeah.
And if you see those little Yowies, those funny little things that live on the flats that make all kinds of weird noises, if you see one of them, if they're running away, they're probably not frightened. They're probably running to get others to come and attack you. Go for your life. You got to see things from their idea.
Yeah.
Anyway, so that's one book. But I also published a scientific paper in the Australian Zoologist.
Oh, okay.
I've been a member of the Royal Zoological Society of New South Wales for 45 years. And so this radio show that I've been doing it's every Saturday morning at 6:40 every week of the year, pretty much. And it's been going for 24 years. This will be the 25th year. But I record, it's one of the earliest citizen science studies. I record the name of the person that's contacted me, often by phone during the radio program or sometimes afterwards on the internet or what have you, or by phone, and the animal that they want identified and the description, the location and the date. And then I put it all, recorded the whole thing. And I put together a scientific study, but I only dared write it because every year the society has a zoological forum, and like last year it was on the dingo from memory, and the year before it might have been on the koala or conservation or legislation. And so in 2013 they decided to have a forum on dangerous ideas in zoology, and so I attended the forum and I gave my PowerPoint presentation, and I said to them, if you think you've heard some dangerous ideas in zoology, well, my presentation is the dangerous idea that there's still large animals, the largest animals in Australia, still unknown to science, and they awarded my presentation the bravest presentation. I was in front of like 100 of Australia's top zoologists.
Wow.
And they loved the talk and the illustrations. The illustrations of by Pixie Burns and others I showed, and this big footprint which I showed to the top Australian zoologist. I said, I don't know if there's hoaxes involved, fabrications or errors. All I can do is this is what's been shown to me and the descriptions I've received, and they said they loved it. They said, we've all received these reports, but you're the first person to ever study them and put them together. And they still don't really believe in them, but so they published my paper, and there it is there.
Oh, wow. Congratulations.
And so that's the first scientific paper on cryptozoology.
Yeah.
And it's called Citizen Science and Cryptozoology, data received from listeners during 18 years of wildlife talk back on ABC North Coast New South Wales local radio. And it's full of tables, which are the most commonly reported species listed in the Threatened Species Conservation Act, and also a number of reports received of species of unidentifiable animals. And then I've also got them actually illustrated. And of course, so there's the Yowie there.
Yeah.
in a scientific journal. This is the oldest scientific journal in Australia as well.
Amazing. What a breakthrough.
And so there's illustrations.
Yeah.
Feeding. I found where an unknown animal's been feeding on wood boring grubs without using a beak or claws to feed on the animals. They're the little footprints of the little, also known as the Jungidae. One of the people had a close encounter and drew exactly what he saw. A fellow by the name of Josh Clark. And and then other things like these black panthers. There's a black panther that was actually shot and photographed by Kurt Angles in Victoria. So, well,
that's great.
There's no way that we can work out what these animals are. Perhaps if we get DNA, and the only thing I can think of is to say to people, because the chance of people say, "Oh, why haven't you got a photograph?" Well, how can you photograph an animal in the bush? How often do you get a chance to photograph a wild dingo in the scrub or anything?
Yeah, that's right.
Is to maybe collect soil samples from footprints and keep that in sealed bags, and eventually, when the science is advanced enough, we may be able to determine what it is by DNA analysis. That's the only way I can think of trying to get an identification. But I think it's important to determine what it is, because if we were able to get positive proof that this animal exists, not only would it be of worldwide importance, but it would because the other possibility, it's a marsupial. It's probably unlikely, but remember the marsupial lion, Thylacines carnifex, which we know that existed definitely up until about 40,000 years ago, and the skeletons have been found in caves in particular. That evolved from a possum and was one of the most powerful carnivores on Earth. So it's an example of where a herbivorous animal evolved into a carnivorous animal, and we know that in the forests in New Guinea up until maybe 9,000 years ago, there was a marsupial gorilla, a thing called Holothurium thomasettii. It might have been more a marsupial panda or a marsupial bear, but it was related to the diprotodonts. In other words, distant related to wombats and koalas. And as we know, for most of the Australian history, until up till about 40,000 years ago, Australia was dominated by giant animals, giant wombat and giant koala-like animals called diprotodons. And we have fossils of a very mobile gorilla or panda-like marsupial. So I mean, there's just the vague possibility that we could be dealing with a surviving megafauna, and in fact, one of the reports from 1912 in the Hawkesbury River, one of the first people you could call a cryptozoologist, a local gentleman, he collected and wrote about what he called the marsupial man. And he had never seen it himself, but he said many people have heard its loud bellowing calls, and several people have seen it, and it's like a big, they called it the native gorilla or the Australian gorilla. And he said at least 3 people saw that it had a pouch with a baby in the pouch, a black furred baby, very much like a kangaroo. So there's a vague possibility, but just imagine if we discovered that there was some giant koala-like animal living in the forests, that very rare. I mean, how wonderful that would be for conservation and increased public interest in our fabulous bushland.
Yeah, amazing. Oh, thank you so much for all that. That's just incredible. There's so much in there I want to unpack, but we'll have to have you back on the show.
Yes, I'm happy to talk.
I'd love a little bit more about the megafauna too. That's fascinating. So, but anyway, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate it, and we'll let you go have your dinner now. And
we'll talk again.
Yeah, we'll see you next time. Thanks. Thanks again, Gary.
Thanks, Gary. Cheers.
Cheers. Bye, Ben. Bye, Cheryl.
Bye.